Welcome to the Rabbi and The Shrink. This is Dr. Margarita Gurri, The Shrink. And this is everyone's favorite rabbi,
Yonason Goldson.
And the good rabbi and I are delighted to have with us Susan Fitzell. She's got a master's in education and a CSP, a certified speaking professional. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm honored. Yeah. Hi.
We're delighted to have you here. You're doing something that a lot of grown-ups never get to. You have for, I don't know how many years, been the teacher's resource, teaching teachers how to teach, how to understand kids, working with neurodiversity. And you've now successfully bridged the gap to helping adults in business do their best. So I'm hoping you can help us with that. You've written way too many books to count. I lost count at 22. You say there's 16, but I think you need to recount because I looked at them all. And you have two YouTube channels, one for education and one for business. The best way to reach her is Susan, S-U-S-A-N, Fitzell, F-I-T-Z-E-L-L, because she doesn't have to sell anything. Just listening to her is all you need. Well, so tell us, how did you get to all this neurodiversity stuff?
Well, I've literally spent my entire career in that space, except it wasn't called neurodiversity at that time. Even though that term has been around now for about 20 years, it's really only bubbled up to the surface about 6 years ago. It may have been talked about at other times, but about 6 years ago, Dr. Fung met with a group of people at Stanford and had a conversation about autism in the workplace, the future of autism and neurodiversity, which was a term that was coined, like I said, years ago. And when he had that conversation, it started to multiply, and Stanford got involved with autism at work initiatives, or some people are calling this neurodiversity at work. But neurodiversity is a bigger umbrella. Autism is under the neurodiversity umbrella. And there's a lot of confusion right now with the language. So when I use the language, I might be using the word a little differently than somebody else, but I'm just being consistent with my language and going by the most sensible definitions. So what happened was, I had been working with schools and educators for my entire career, let's say a few decades. And then I'd be traveling around the country to different school districts and sitting next to executives on the plane, managers on the plane, and we'd start to chit chat. And I started to realize, maybe even 8 or 9 years ago, that the students that I had in the classroom and the students that I'm helping teachers help are now also in the workplace. And these managers are like, what do I do? What do I do with this worker who is not focused, or is coming to meetings late, or wears headsets to the meetings because he says the sound bothers him, or, and so then I found myself troubleshooting with these executives on the airplane. And the more I got into those conversations, the more I saw the need. So about 6 years ago, I started nurturing this path and finding out what's happening out in the work world. And at first I thought, well, gee, I don't really, I'm not worked a little bit. I have some experience in technology. I worked for a company called Teradyne many years ago, being a supervisor in a printed circuit board department. I remember when they installed the Ethernet. I'm probably dating myself, but the Ethernet in that company. And they were all excited. I was there when they were doing it. And so what I realized was that the same issues that I dealt with for my entire career as a teacher, and then as a teacher, coach, and speaker and trainer, were the same issues that management, CEOs, corporations, and organizations are dealing with their employees. And then I'll take it a little further. Then the neurodiversity movement came up, and I had a video on neurodiversity on my business channel, and company saw it a year ago and said, we'd like you to do a TED-like talk on neurodiversity in the workplace. And a lot of people had had said to me, Susan, I don't even know what that word means. What is it? What is it? Don't do that. And And I realized that was where I was being called to go, because
Cool.
the more I researched it, the more I saw the need. And then the more I researched and talked to people and talked to organizations about what happens in the workplace was the same issues that I've been dealing with for 30 years in education. So, I mean, the issues are the same, the location is different, and that's about it.
So paying attention and asking yourself questions and wanting to be of service has been a good path for you. So
Yes.
Tell us, what is neurodiversity then in the workplace? What's it look like?
Okay, so neurodiversity is brain diversity in a sense. So neuro, brain, comes from the brain. Some people will call it as if you are neurodivergent. And here's where the language gets tricky, because different people like different language. But neurodivergent means that my brain has been wired differently since birth. And those people are the people who might have dyslexia, people who have dyspraxia, OCD. And I'm going to use identity first language here, because that is what the majority of autistic people want, adults anyway, at this point in time. There's also some controversy because some people say people first language, but there's also now a big push for identity first language. And out of respect for the people who want that, the autistic people themselves, I'm going to use it. So when you have neurodiversity, which again is dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia, OCD, and several other things, there's a lot that goes under that category. And even that is not firm. That right now is kind of in flux. What goes under that category? Whose brains are wired differently from birth? And it's neurodevelopmental. That group of people and also people who we call neurotypical, average everyday folk. The people that do well on the tests in school, the people who do well in school, the people who can function in society very well, don't have any problem. They're just they might be really bright everyday folk, but they're everyday folk that fit all the social norms, maybe even all the learning norms that schools want to teach to, do pretty well on standardized tests. And so they're neurotypical. And oftentimes the neurotypical people find the neurodivergent people difficult to deal with, odd ducks, quirky, and they don't necessarily understand each other. And when you put all of them under the same umbrella, that umbrella is neurodiversity. It's neuro, basically brain diversity. It's the diversity of cognition. And the reality is that we have neurodiverse people everywhere in the world and in our workplaces already. But now there's an extra awareness and in some cases initiatives to deliberately bring neurodivergent thinking into the workplace. And the hiring programs for autistic adults is a part of that awareness and initiative.
Does it help a company?
Thank you, Doctor. There's a depth to what you're saying that I think is really worth looking into. I remember learning that during World War II, the British found that people with dyslexia happened to have a talent for code breaking. And that whatever the quirk was in the brain that made it difficult for them to read gave them an advantage in breaking down codes. And I know for myself, I don't visualize, which apparently is somewhat rare. I don't see images and connect them with words. And I was recently told that explains why I'm very good at making connections between ideas that other people don't immediately see.
Yeah.
So, as you said, we tend to look at people who are not, narrow mainstream as somehow defective or deficient. And when we talk about building a diverse community, we're often talking about ethnicity. But the drum that I keep banging is what we want is people who think differently.
Yes.
We want people to see the world differently, because that creates a community where there are so many different perspectives being represented.
Correct.
And that increases everybody's capacity for seeing a larger picture and recognizing more profound truths.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I mean, cognitive diversity is critical to corporate or organizational success. I mean, it really is.
Absolutely. Well, the rabbi and I had the privilege of interviewing one of my friends who's a world expert on on diversity and unconscious bias. I know these are areas in your expertise. Dr. Helen Turnbull, also a CSP and a global CSP. And she said something that was profound. I would love for you to address that we want to hire as business people, we want to hire for diversity, but then we train for sameness. So how do I know if I'm a business person in the world and I'm in the audience watching and listening, how do I know that I am training for diversity versus training for sameness? What does it look like?
Well, you'd know it if you were doing it. If you don't know that you're doing it, you're probably not doing it unless you have a really already established welcoming culture in your corporation. I mean, this is anecdotal.
Good. I love your stories.
3 years ago, I attended a conference that was hosted at Microsoft. It was put on by a man, Stu Shader, one of the employees at the time. And he became very interested in neurodiversity, different thinking. That word wasn't used at the time, but basically different ways of thinking and being in the world. And he held a conference on dyslexia the first year. I didn't attend that one. I didn't find out about it till too late, because he found out that he was dyslexic after his daughter got diagnosed, which is exactly what happened to me. I found out that I was dyslexic after my son was diagnosed, and the doctor looked at me and said, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. I just always thought I was a slow reader, and I had to read things over and over and over again. I didn't realize why. And I'd get tired. I'd read 2 pages and I'd fall asleep on the book. Now I understand why. And this happened to Stu. And so he held this big conference about dyslexia and working with people in the workforce with dyslexia. The following year, he followed it up with a conference on autism. They were that was a fabulous conference. And so when I was there, I was, in the hallway. You have these hallway conversations. There was a woman there who had spent her entire life. She was about my age. I won't tell you what that is. Spent her entire life in Silicon Valley. And her father worked in Silicon Valley. And she said, when I think back to my childhood, everybody was a character. Everyone who worked in Silicon Valley was a character. Everybody thought uniquely. We had the most interesting parties and interesting events because, even just what people wore stood out. And she says, the problem we have now, even in Silicon Valley, is that we hire, just like you said, for sameness, where we got HR in there. We're using artificial intelligence to sift through resumes. I think companies lose a lot of talent that way. I think it's a big mistake, but it's easier, faster, quicker, more efficient, probably cost effective. Well, and that's debatable too, because it's cost effective if you're losing talent,
in the short run, right?
Yeah. And so what she was saying is now, we're hiring people and we want them to fit a certain mold. And now we're lacking the diversity of thought. We don't have those characters in the workplace anymore. And when we do, sometimes other people are like, ooh, or, what's wrong with that person? And there isn't a culture in place to accept differences. And, we talk about that all the time, but there's also neuro differences. And so if you, for instance, there's one of my clients said to me, we were having a meeting. This is before COVID. So it was in-person meeting around a conference table. And one of the young engineers came in with headsets in. And he had been doing that. And it was irritating his manager and called him out in front of everybody this one time and said, what are you doing wearing headsets and listening to music while we're having this meeting? And the young man was a young engineer. He said, I'm not listening to music. I have a hard time with the outside, with all the background noise. And this helps me to focus and listen to you better. And it was this judgment that was made immediately because this young man didn't fit the norm. You don't go to a meeting with headsets in. And yet his reason for wearing the headsets was perfectly acceptable once they knew why. And that's the kind of, if you have a culture in your company that is going to question things like that, and be concerned about that employee who doesn't make eye contact, or, worried about the sales guy who's been doing great in sales for decades, but now you put in an LMS system with a testing part to it that's a standardized computer program, and you're asking this dyslexic to pass that test for every new product that comes out before they go out and sell it. You're going to lose that employee, and you're going to lose a lot of money, because that employee was an excellent salesperson, had a lot of company IP, and now they're out the door because you put in something in place that's great for neurotypicals and people who test well, but not necessarily a dyslexic that is excellent at sales. And a lot of this is, I don't want to get into stereotypes, but if you read about what are the strengths of dyslexics, often they're very personable and very friendly, and often, nothing is ever always. And they also have amazing spatial intelligence. So, if you've got a person who's with dyslexia who's going into a company to sell a product, and that product is to fit in a certain place, or, be on the line, I used to know what this was. I worked in a factory as a teenager, but the line where all the people are working, you've got somebody who really can, assembly line. Yeah. You can have somebody who could really do an excellent job at what they do because of their dyslexia. And unfortunately, if you've got systems in place that don't honor how different people's brains work, you're going to lose those people. Either because of harassment that happens, or because you're measuring the wrong thing. Your performance review is based on, well, he can't pass his test, instead of look at the sales he's making. It's
the example you gave, Susan. There's a point that I'd like to, maybe you could develop for us, because I think it's confusing and it's challenging. That this example you gave of the fellow wearing the headphones, right? Cosmetically, he was projecting what would naturally be interpreted as disrespect. Right? And when we are part of any community, there are certain expected norms. And if I violate those norms, if I deviate from them, that's going to it's going to call attention to me. It's going to send a message, whether it's intentional or not. And it could affect the health of the community. So what is the strategy we can use to allow people to do what they need to do, to be who they are, in a way that doesn't somehow sabotage the culture that we live in with the appearance of impropriety?
Right. So the best example of that is from a company called Ultranauts, who only hires people in the spectrum for the most part, because that's what they do. And it was started by two young men from MIT. They started this company. It's essentially, I think, a software company. And a couple years into working, they're all working remotely all over the world. And someone suggested, they were having some difficulties with how do you communicate? How do you connect remotely? Someone suggested, wouldn't it be great if we all had a user's manual? And so they created what they call BioDeck, but a user's manual for each employee. So now everybody has access to say, your name, what you prefer to be called, when's the best time of day to typically to connect with you if you're not a morning person.
That's
is it better?
Great.
Yes, it's fabulous.
Yeah.
A lot of companies are really interested in this, and companies could create their own, but now that person with the headphones has a way, because most times they're masking, they're trying to hide, they don't want it to come out. So this young man may not even have realized he was violating a social norm. He was just doing what he needed to take care of himself, or to be able to focus and do a good job. He might not have known the social implications of that. Or you could say, well, he should have told his manager why he had them on. Who knows? He may not even have thought of it. Or some people say, do it first, then ask, don't ask permission, just wait and see what happens. Who knows? I don't know that part of the story. But if you all had a user's manual, then he could have said, well, I have difficulty with background noise, so I will be wearing headsets. I'm not playing music. I'm listening to you. It actually allows me to hear you better and focus better. So that type of tool in a culture, in the workplace, in a workplace culture, can be highly effective. And, some companies, they do a stand-up morning check-in. And so they can check in and they can talk to people about what they need. If you develop a company, that culture that accepts that. So my thinking is that what we need to do is we need to look at our company culture and see how accepting is it for the way different people learn, the way different people focus, the way different people communicate, and provide options for that. And most of those options don't deter from productivity or the culture at all. They actually might help, because what typically happens is the people with neurodivergence, people whose brains work differently, they're often doing what's called masking, and they're trying to hide who they were. I had a writer who was editing for me for years. She was also a friend. We also studied Kung Fu together. And one day she's in my house, and I've known her now for years, and she's been working with me. I contracted her to write. She was a freelance writer too. And all of a sudden she said, I said, I learned this word masking, I didn't even know this thing existed. And she says, oh, I mask all the time. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I have ADHD and I don't want anybody to know because they might think less of me. So I hide it. I do everything I can to hide it. Well, when you do that, what I'm learning is it stresses people out. So by the time they get home, if it's an in-person workplace, they're exhausted from hiding who they are all day long and, trying to be somebody they're not. That's an exhausting thing to try to do. And that's what happens to a lot of people who are already in corporations who aren't neurodivergent friendly. And so they try to mask, and sometimes they do it well and sometimes they don't.
And that's the job of the ethical leader, is in the example you gave, don't call somebody out in public,
right?
But speak to them privately and say, are you aware that what you're doing is seen this way? And then you can find out why it's going on. And when that doesn't happen, then we're calling you, doctor, as the misbehavior expert to clean things up. Right?
Well, I like the idea of the bio deck. There's like Pokemon cards for all your people. What are their strengths, their secondary strengths, their the things that may look like a disadvantage, but are actually, what are the advantage of that? I love that idea. And then that explains the misbehavior. So I was wondering, when I was looking at your articles, you have one on martial arts and the awakening of a public school teacher, or some title such as that. And I'm going, why martial arts? And I thought, okay, so that's good. I like that a lot. Well,
do you want to know the answer to that?
Because you did Kung Fu.
Yes, I did. Yes.
So is there more of an answer than that?
Well, I think I did what that book is about. That was a turning point in my life. Just to say that little book. And I hated to exercise. I'm still not thrilled with certain, I've just never been one to go to the gym and do the boring treadmill or
there's so many ways to exercise that aren't boring. Yeah.
So I loved Kung Fu since I was a child. I don't know if you remember the show Kung Fu. I mean, It was called Kung Fu with David Carradine. And I loved watching it. Yeah. Yes. And there's something about it that appealed to me. And so I got to a point in my, when I was a young mother, I've got to get out of the house and do something to take care of myself, and I've got to get physically active. So I went to different martial arts school and went to one that had Kung Fu was a lot of weapons. That sounds scary, but swords and spears and what they call staffs, and I literally saw them all on the wall. I was scared to death. And I remember saying to the teacher, if I study Kung Fu, do I have to use those? And he lied to me and told me no. I know now that he was lying to me. And so I went and watched the class, and I had been doing yoga for years, and it was very yogic, and there was a lot of yoga in that style of Kung Fu. And so I started doing it. I did it for 30 years, but with traveling and everything, it was challenging. But in that first year, I had been teaching high school students with learning disabilities. At that point in time, I was still teaching high school students with learning disabilities. At that point, I think it was like 13 years. And all of a sudden, I'm in a class where I feel like I've got a disability. I'm uncoordinated. Now I know a little bit more about why, but I'm uncoordinated. I have trouble. The teacher would show me something. I'm ADHD, didn't really have that label then either. And he'd share, do these X moves, and I'd do them 3 times, and he'd walk away, keep practicing. And I went, oh my gosh, I already forgot it. And it was like, yeah, the first thing I wrote was the Kung Fu Parable, and what that experience did, and this is the reason I wrote the book for teachers, is it really put me in the shoes of my students who learn differently. I did not, because I was pretty good in school. I could have been better if I knew how I learned it that in high school. I learned how I learned it in college and did much better in college. However, I really didn't struggle academically, and I'd never been into sports. So I'd never really come face to face with my uncoordination challenge and my memory for physical movement challenge. And I would get more nervous over a Kung Fu test than I ever did on an academic test. So it just taught me a lot about myself and what it felt like to be my students.
Good for you.
It was a life changer for me. Mm-hmm.
And
it's how people feel in the workplace when they're trying, when they're not able to be who they really are.
And it goes the other direction as well. You just reminded me when I was early in my teaching career, and we started teaching in August, and one year by September I was burned out. It felt like June.
What happened?
It should have been June.
It did, yeah. June couldn't come soon enough. I had a group of students, one particular class. I mean, there's only one way to describe them. It was the biggest bunch of bananas you've ever seen in your life. And I gave the first test, which I'd been giving for years in the same material. Every single student flunked it, except one who got an A. But and I didn't even know where to start. We have the holiday of Sukkot comes in September, October. We get a week off. I spent the entire week reading Harry Potter. It was just pure escape from reality for me. Mm-hmm. Well, my wife is a special ed teacher. And then I said to her, I just don't know what to do. And she helped me modify my curriculum, modify my tests. And I came back and I was able to turn the year into a success.
Good.
That's wonderful.
And, you're talking about how the people who are masking, it's exhausting. Sometimes on the other side, it can be exhausting too, trying to figure out how to deal with people we don't understand.
Right.
And all the more so when we're responsible for them.
Mm-hmm.
But to have people that would have, first of all, to have the presence of mind to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
And to have the resources that can actually offer us help that's going to serve us and serve them. It makes all the difference in the world.
It does.
Susan, you tell a great story about learning to ask for help. And you tell one about your daddy and you. And I think it served you well in the work you do to create cultures where people can ask for help. Could you please tell us that story? I think it's charming.
So I grew up during a pretty strong feminist age where, we were taught as women or girls, you do everything you can by yourself. You're capable, do it yourself. You don't need to ask other people for help all the time. I mean, really, that was somewhat in the generation that I grew up in, and also was kind of a family thing. We were very self-sufficient, take care of ourselves. So I really, the firstborn child, really wanted to do everything well by myself. And I got a car. My uncle had given me a car for like $200. And so I was working on, learning how to use the car, because I had read or heard, women should know how to repair their own cars. That was before they were as electronic as they are today. And so I decided one day that I needed to change my oil. So I got out in the front of the house, right in front of our house on the street, got a big bin, put it under the car, checked the oil. All right, went underneath, unscrewed, the tank, let all the oil drip into the bin. And then, once it was all out, stopped dripping, put the cap back on, pulled the bin out, and then checked the oil again, and it was still full. Like, what did I do? And then I knew there was another dipstick in there. So I pulled that one out. It was a transmission fluid and it was empty. I went, oh my gosh, I emptied the transmission fluid instead of the oil. What do? I have oil. I don't have transmission fluid and I'm nowhere near a gas station. And I had a relationship. I was, 16, 17. And I had a relationship with my dad at that time, was like, I am not asking for his help. There's no way I can do this by myself. And, I think probably some of that was just normal teenager stuff, but I wasn't going to do it. And then I was stuck. I was totally stuck. And luckily he worked shift work. And that was a shift where he wasn't working in the day. He was working the night shift. So he was home. So I had to swallow my pride and called him up. And I said, Dad, I need to get a ride to the gas station so I can get transmission fluid. And I told him what I did. And he was just happy. He's like, oh, that's great that you're doing that, learning how to use the car. Okay, I'll be right over. And then he came over and he picked me up and, we went to the gas station and got oil. And I realized he was really happy. I'm looking at my father in the car and he's like, hey, she needs me. I can help her do this thing. And he was proud of me for doing it. He never said that, but he was. I could tell. Yeah, he was proud of me for trying. And, so we fixed the car up and everything. But what it made me realize is, a lot of us are either raised in a way, or I almost think in a way our school systems, the way they operate, where you're all studying for the test and you have to get the test right in order to be successful. And if you don't get answers right, then who knows what's going to happen to you in your life because you can't pass the standardized test. I think there's a lot of us who struggle to ask for help when we need it. And they say it's a lot of women, you go to women's, studies and everything, they say women especially, but I even think men too. And I don't think there's a gender thing to that. And, we have to be able to ask for help when we need it. And two places where that applies in this topic is, as managers, one of the things that it's important to do is to not only ask for help with those to help. You got an employee that's puzzling you, you're not trying to work with them. Not only ask for help, ask the right people for help. I mean, I know one of the arguments right now in the autism at work world is a lot of the autistic people are saying, ask an autistic person for help. Although if you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. They're all different, as we all are. But, some people think, oh, you're autistic. I know exactly what you are. No, you don't. And so it's important to go to someone who really understands that background, has worked, either is autistic or really seriously understands the spectrum of challenges that might be faced and the strengths that might be faced by someone who's autistic. And the same with any other brain divergence or learning difference. I've never liked the term learning disability. And I was horrified when I found out that all those learning disabilities that I worked with in schools, when you got into the adult world, they were in the DSM and they were considered mental disorders. I said, what? And then I was informed that's because people can't get help unless it's in the DSM. So all these things that just make us different and unique and wonderful, they end up in this category so people can get the help they need. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we just were flexible enough in our environments that we could provide the help so everybody can be more successful and not have to have a label? That's ideal world, but wouldn't it be wonderful? And I think we can work a little bit towards that direction, in our workplaces, and even wouldn't it be great in our schools? I like to
an appreciation of that. I'm sorry to step on you. Did you want to finish that?
I was only going to say, we live in a world with, starting in preschool, we're a deficit mindset. We are looking at what's wrong with kids, and then what's wrong with elementary, and what's wrong with teenagers, and what's wrong with workers, and what's wrong with millennials. Why don't instead we look at their gifts? So I call that instead of a deficit mindset, how about a gifts mindset? Even then, one of the mistakes I think we have made is we tell the kids what's right with them is that they're smart instead of that they try hard. Because if you tell a kid they're smart, then they're afraid to make mistakes. So I think how we identify anything on the spectrum of what's working well or not in the context. I was put in a class when I was in first grade that had the word retard on the door.
I came as a refugee from Cuba. I didn't speak English particularly well, and I was pretty traumatized by how mean some of the teachers were in the classroom. This particular teacher was very abusive, and so I decided to not speak and became selectively mute for quite some time, just at school, not anywhere else. I was a blabbermouth and still am, right, Rabbi? I mean, I've been known to have an opinion. But because of that, I think that's why I became a psychologist. The other kids that were in that class with me, I could see there were the ones that had what my father would call it neuroplasticity, that their brains reached beyond what we expect. They were different somehow. So he back then didn't use the term, the neurodiversity, but he was making it sound like a benefit. And there are all the kids, ones that suffered with stuttering, or that somehow were dyslexic, or this. I myself am ADHD, a little ADD squirrel, but I use it to my advantage. How many speakers have ADD, really?
I think probably a lot of us.
I know it makes us really good at managing a crowd and paying attention and all that kind of stuff. So let's say then that you're working with the group. Everyone's listening to you now. If I want to help everyone have a diverse mindset so they can bring out the best in their team, what do you suggest people do? What are the things that facilitate a richness of diversity of thought in a team meeting? Let's just focus on a meeting. Let's be specific.
I believe that, first of all, we have to address the elephant in the room. And so as much as people might say, well, we have to do training, I believe that we've got to talk about the different learners around the table. We call it different learners, different ways of processing, different, divergent cognition, and look at everybody's strengths. And, that becomes team building and maybe soft skills. But the reality is, until we recognize the strengths around the table and can realize if we will be better off as a team, we will be more successful as a team, we'll be more innovative as a team. If we can work with people's differences, be a little flexible, then we could really reach, some high limits in what we can do. I mean, the teams that have done that, the companies, the corporations that have done it, have found they have greater innovation, more patents, more productivity and efficiency. You get somebody on the team that is really efficiency oriented. They can't stand anything out of order. I'm kind of like one of those people. I hate inefficiency. And instead of thinking that as that person's constantly complaining about the way we've always done it, instead listen and say, ooh, what, maybe we should try it. Maybe that actually will work. So it's really first cultural. We've got to build a culture that opens up our minds and says, okay, let's look at people's strengths and how can we work with them, instead of what's wrong with that person? They're doing this wrong. Let's put them on a performance review. The other thing we want to do is give concrete strategies. So one of the things that I know you've been through some of my articles. Initially, I've written about 54. I would say almost 45 of them are on this topic alone.
Slacker.
Yeah. And in the past year, I've written a lot about this, and in the process doing research and always learning myself. However, one of the things that I think is missing in a lot of the neurodiversity initiatives and work is concrete strategies.
Yes.
What can we do concretely? So for instance, in a keynote I gave recently, it's like, okay, you've got remote workers, you've got workers in-house, you have certain ways that you communicate. Could you provide options? Maybe some people prefer the good old-fashioned phone. They don't like typing. Maybe the dyslexic would prefer to talk on the phone rather than have to type. Offers options like Slack or chat or email. Which one do you like best? Giving people options instead of saying, oh, you only can do it this one way. That's the other thing. None of those things would deter or detract from the work you're doing. So having tools that are acceptable for everybody. Another example is, let's say it's a job that the company has dress code and a uniform. One of the things that came up recently is there are people who are very have sensory overload or have sensitive to certain materials. Is it possible that they can have wear clothing instead of doesn't have to be sweatpants, but maybe something softer to wear as pants that the dress code, or if you have a specific uniform because you're customer facing, that there's a couple options of material. Maybe some would be soft cotton and some would be the poly cotton blend, whatever that is, have some options for people that respect what's comfortable. Because the reality is, if you force someone into clothing that's uncomfortable and they're in it all day, they might be fine in the morning, but by the end of the day, they're like, because it's itchy or scratchy or uncomfortable, and it might even make them grumpy. And then they get home and they just can't wait to take the clothes off. It's something that we don't often think about. And that's really come to the forefront with remote, with after COVID. Because how many people now say, I've done every Zoom meeting with leggings on because I'm more comfortable and I work even better. So, safety has to be considered. You're not going to wear comfy, cushy sneakers if you're on a factory floor and you need steel toe shoes. So there has to be practicality behind it, and safety and branding and imaging. And so it can't all be one way, but we can make some accommodations to give people choice. Does that
really brings us? Yeah, it really brings us back to, I think, a point we touched on earlier, that there need to be certain norms in a community, but we can be flexible.
Yes.
And not overly rigid or regimental.
Correct.
Because some rules really are kind of arbitrary, and others have a reason why they're there.
Yes.
And being willing to sort of stretch the boundaries without completely tearing them down, it takes thought, it takes effort, it takes compromise, but ultimately the payoff really is, way out of proportion to the effort that we put into it.
Correct. And again, I have a background in education, and the solution is the same in the corporation or in the business world as it is in education. Pull your team together and brainstorm solutions with them.
I like that.
Then they own it, right? So instead of top down saying to the team, well, we know we've got some divergent thinkers in the group, or we've hired this autistic person, which is the worst thing you can do. But don't call them out and label them, and but we've got some different thinkers, divergent thinkers. We want to be most productive as a team on Tuesday afternoon. Well, let's get together remotely or in person and brainstorm solutions for this, and this. Maybe solutions for communication that'll work for everybody best. Solutions for attendance at a meeting or presenting at a meeting, because some people, especially people in the spectrum, or serious introverts, presenting is their greatest nightmare. Yes. Is there another way to get that information out? Solutions for, background noise in the meeting room or in the work area. We've gone to open concept work area, and let's say it's somebody if they go into the workplace, they've gotten rid of all the offices and the cubbies, and they're sitting across from another person, a nightmare for someone with ADHD. And what can we do differently? So when you include the group that's affected in the solution making, instead of having it come down from HR or some other top down way, you're going to have more buy-in, more people happy about it, people who may not even be neurodivergent but say, man, I'd like that too. Because the reality is, in education, I would say good for all. With the strategies I'm going to share with you are good for all students, but they're critical for the students who learn differently. In business, I realized it's the same thing. The strategies that I'm going to share with you are good for all employees, but critical for the students whose brains are wired differently. And call it whatever you want, but I like that. Brains are wired differently, and neurodivergent, if you have all the whatever you want to say. And the other reason that would be really important is the first thing that was brought to my attention after my keynote 2 weeks ago was, well, we have to do something different for this employee, then that is an accommodation, and that has to go through HR, and that then becomes an intervention, and there's all this paperwork and legalities around it. And I could see the like, I really want to do this, but how do I do this so that it's not so overwhelming and bureaucratic paperwork filled? And my thought is, do things that work for everybody. Just make it a culture that has within the norms that are critical, make it a culture that everybody can thrive in and provide those options.
Doctor, isn't this a callback to our last episode, I think, with Ron Carucci, who said that
Yes.
It's been documented when people perceive unfairness, that legitimizes in their own minds unethical behavior. And if I perceive rules as being arbitrary, and I don't see there's a willingness to accommodate me and my needs, which may be perfectly reasonable, then I become resentful. I become mistrustful. I don't see that there's a real interest in allowing me to do my best work. And that has a corrosive effect on me, which in turn has a corrosive effect on the community. So
exactly.
It's really in everyone's best interest to
yes.
try to make these, to have that flexibility and create a community that where everyone can thrive.
That's right. Well, and there's a flip side to that, is if we make accommodations for certain people, well, we have a dress code, but that guy's allowed to wear sweatpants, and nobody else had any input on why or anything, because now it was an HR intervention type thing. Now there's, and this is actually in one of the articles I wrote, in all my articles, almost all of them, I consult. I've got a team that are neurodivergent themselves, many autistic themselves, and they review every single article that I put out there.
That's
every one of them, because I'm neurodivergent, but I'm not autistic. I have sometimes I think I have some tendencies that are like that I share some tendencies with them, but I don't know that world. So let's bring them in on my team and make sure that all my articles pass muster that way. And of course, because everybody's different, there's still probably are things that someone else will say, no, that's not right. It is what it is. But if I have certain exceptions for certain people, and we've gone through all the right paths with HR and intervention and all those things, there are team members who say, why does he get to wear sweatpants and a t-shirt when we have to wear business casual? Now you've got the other side is resentful. Why are you getting to come in to work, at 9:00 when the rest of us have to come in at 8? So again, either side is going to develop resentments if things aren't approached appropriately and in a way that is building team spirit, good morale, and everybody feels like they had a voice. I think that's a lot of people just want a voice in changes that are being made.
I think that's brilliant, and everyone should check out all your writings. I was spellbound. I don't always read all the articles, but I thought it was fascinating.
Well,
all right, now we've come to the time of the show. Rabbi, the word of the day, and then we'll come back to our guest expert, and she'll have some final words.
Well, I'd like to introduce the word of the day with a teaching from the sages. They say that one who studies like a child, or as a child, is compared to ink written on fresh paper. One who studies in old age is compared to ink written on smudged paper. Now, on first glance, you might think this is sort of ageism. It's a simple warning to take advantage of youth, that our brains work differently. When we're younger, we didn't get into this conversation so much, but our brains work different. To try to learn a new language at an advanced age is very difficult. As a child, you just pick it right up. But so many other things to the complexities or the complex faculties of thinking develop over time, and to take advantage of youth to acquire information so that we're then ready to put it into practice as we mature. That's an opportunity we don't want to miss, but there's an additional, because that could be a little bit depressing. I'm not young anymore. So did I miss the boat? The sages are also telling us that there's a difference between being a child or being childlike, and that children love to learn. They just thrive on, they're curious, they want to know, they don't make a lot of judgments until a certain point. And if we're childlike in our thinking, then we are always able to learn in a way that is fresh and new. And the imagery of trying to read something on smudged paper where the ink and the background are blurring together, and you have to work so hard. I mean, it's like the learning issues that we've been talking about. You simply can't avoid the struggle there. But when it's on crisp, clean paper, the words jump off the page and are much easier to process. So with that introduction, the word of the day is palimpsest. Palimpsest, which is a parchment or paper from which the writing has been partially or completely erased to make room for another text. When something has a new layer or aspect or appearance that builds on its past and allows us to see or perceive parts of this past. So we're talking about smudge paper, but there's also the idea of having layers. In fact, they say that when Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, he painted image upon image upon image. And that even though we only think we're seeing the top image, we're actually, it's influenced, it's affected by all those layers that are beneath it. And so in a culture, to think about, instead of how we're different from one another, how we're at odds with each other, think of it more in terms of layers. I guess I could call in Shrek at this point, right? Those ogres are like onions, right?
One of my other favorite animated characters. Yes.
But to embrace the layers and the complexities of life, because that's what gives us texture and depth, and really makes it vibrant and worthwhile.
Yes, love that.
So, Susan, do you have some final words of wisdom or call to action for all of us?
I believe that the final words of wisdom is, if you want to create a work culture, an environment where you're going to see more innovation, more problem solving, more, let's say, efficiency, productivity, then really look to your people. And the thing is, a lot of people are looking at, oh, I should bring in this group of people. They're already there. Realize you already have many people whose brains are wired differently in the workplace. So if you start working with your teams and saying, okay, what can we do to make things better? You've been remote for years. Certain things work better for you at home. Now we'd like you to come into the office at least 2 or 3 days a week. What can we do that can bring some of the comfort that you had at home into the workplace? Some of the camaraderie that you got in Zoom into the workplace? Those kinds of things. As a starting spot, starting place is a great place to begin. You can do the work of starting an initiative, and there's organizations out there to help you do that, and Autism at Work initiative. However, I almost feel like there's a foundation that could be started no matter what by anybody, any company, any group that already paves the way for the beginning of people to work together well, no matter how their brains are wired.
You're doing phenomenal work, Susan, and thank you for the contribution. Right? Do you have a new adventure on the horizon?
I do. So for 30 years, I studied Kung Fu, and there were many times I would wish that I could dance and do that in addition or instead, because I've always loved to dance. And going back to my dad, some of my fondest memories with my dad is dancing with my dad at weddings and parties, or when I was in college and we had a party. And he was an amazing dancer. He could ballroom dance not only on the floor, but on roller skates. And he could whip me around the floor without me ever having I never had a dance lesson. So outside of just before my wedding, getting a dance lesson so my husband and I could dance at our wedding, I never really pursued it. And I've been married for 39 years and it wasn't something I had time to do. And my husband wasn't really interested in it. And finally, last year, I said, you know what? In this last chapter of my life, I'm going to dance. And I started taking ballroom dancing. And because it's COVID, I didn't take group lessons. I'm taking private lessons. And I am at the end of this month, I think it's 23rd, I am literally going to my first dance competition. I'm going to be, I'm like really excited about it. I have a ballroom dress and I got to learn how to do this dramatic makeup. I have no clue how to do. I'm watching YouTube videos to figure out how to do that.
Yeah.
Learning how to do hair so that's more ballerina-ish.
So what dance are you going to do? Which one?
Waltz. I'm doing 3: waltz, foxtrot, and tango. Yeah. And dance is I was always doing Kung Fu because I felt it really worked my brain. And I really believe you got to work your brain till you die, or if you want brain health. And I'm really surprised at how hard dancing is. It's actually pretty difficult if you're learning how to do it beyond social. Social dancing's fine and not that hard. But if you're trying to compete, oh my gosh, things I have to remember. It's really amazing. It's been an amazing.
Can't wait to hear how it goes.
Yeah, you give me an opportunity. You give me an opportunity to, I don't think I've ever had to quote one of my favorite songs. I hope you dance.
There you go. Yes, I will. I'm very excited. And it's, I'm like asking my teacher, I've only been studying for like 5 months. Are you sure I'm ready? He's like, oh yeah, you're ready. Like, okay. So it's good.
Well,
I'm excited.
whether dancing on the floor in the ballroom or dancing through your career and helping us be more nimble on our feet.
There you go. What a great analogy.
Hey,
metaphor,
that's why I make the big bucks.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And Doctor, what's the last word?
Well, final words. I think if we look at people like Susan Fitzell, you can see that one of the aspects of doing well in business is maintaining that childlike learning atmosphere that the rabbi. I did martial arts too, San Shin, beginner's mind. What are you doing to keep your mind fresh? Are you being critical of yourself? You're letting yourself learn new things, learning to dance, learning how to whistle. What are you doing new? And look around in your work environments too. What's working for you? And what is it that needs a little bit of a zhuzh? There you are. Am I Jewish now, Rabbi?
Yeah.
What are you doing that needs a bit of a learning zhuzh? And ask yourself first, where is your neurodiversity? And how can you honor the gifts of all those around you to make your life at home and at work even better? And that's all I have to say about that. Susan, thank you for joining us. Rabbi, as always, it's great to have you on. This is the Rabbi and the Shrink, and we'll see you at the next episode. Thank you and be well.
Thank you for listening to the Rabbi and the Shrink, Everyday Ethics Unscripted. To book Dr. Red Shoe, Dr. Margarita Gurri, or Rabbi Yonason Goldson as speakers or advisors for your organization, contact them at therabbiandtheshrink.com. This has been a Dr. Red Shoe production.